There are stories people tell to frighten children, legends about lost souls, shadows along lonely roads, women who appear in the middle of the night. For a long time, I believed those stories were nothing more than folklore from small rural communities. Today, I think differently. What I'm about to tell you happened to my family over several decades. Some of the people involved are already dead. Others simply refuse to talk about it. And there are those who still believe that whatever caused all of this is still waiting. Waiting for someone. I spent my childhood in a small rural community. It was a quiet place, surrounded by farmland, dirt roads, and old properties that seemed as though they had always existed. I spent much of my life at my grandparents' house. Beside the property stood an old corral where I played almost every day. But what truly caught people's attention was located at the end of the main road. There was a grave. A single grave. So old that no one could identify who had been buried there. It was made of reddish earth, and time had completely erased any name or inscription. The oldest residents claimed that the grave had existed even before the community itself was founded. No one knew exactly who rested there, but everyone shared the same opinion. It was better not to disturb it. My grandmother used to say that the dead deserved peace, and that certain things remain quiet only as long as they are left undisturbed. For decades, no one touched that grave, until my grandfather decided to build a fence around the property. Since the grave stood directly in the path of the construction, he gathered a few friends to help him, and without giving it much thought, they moved the grave. At the time, it seemed like a completely ordinary decision. No one imagined that such a simple act would change our family's life for years to come. The first signs appeared shortly afterward, but it wasn't my grandfather who noticed them. It was my mother's younger sister, a curious little girl who had a habit of staring into the darkness through her bedroom window. And during one of those nights, she saw something she would never forget. A woman, very tall, dressed entirely in black, standing outside the house, watching, without making a single movement, as if she were waiting for the right moment to enter. And the most frightening part was that it was only the beginning. At first, everyone believed it was simply a child's imagination. After all, children see things adults ignore all the time. But my aunt insisted that it was real. Every night, shortly after sunset, she returned to the window. And every night she saw the same figure. The woman was unnaturally tall, taller than anyone in the community. She wore black clothing that seemed to blend into the surrounding darkness. Her hair was so long that it covered almost her entire face, like a veil, as if she didn't want to be recognized, or perhaps didn't want anyone to see what truly lay behind those dark strands. The strangest thing was her behavior. She never wandered around the property. She never watched the animals. She never paced through the yard. The woman simply appeared, and then followed the exact same path every time. She crossed the yard, passed through the kitchen, and silently walked toward the last bedroom in the house. An empty room. A room that had once belonged to one of my uncles before he moved away. Every night, without exception, always the same route. My mother was terrified, but her sister seemed fascinated. While the adults avoided talking about it, she watched everything with curiosity, as though trying to understand a recurring visitor. It was during this period that something happened which my mother never managed to forget. One night, she woke up needing to use the bathroom. Since she would have to cross the dark house alone, she decided to wake her sister and ask her to come along. But the bed beside hers was empty. Alarmed, she searched the room. That's when she noticed a silhouette standing in front of the window. It was her sister, motionless, looking outside. My mother approached slowly. and asked what she was doing. The answer came without the slightest hint of fear. "I'm waiting for the lady." My mother felt an immediate chill run through her body. "What lady?" The girl pointed toward the darkness outside. "The one who comes every night." My mother didn't want to look, didn't want confirmation. She simply pulled her sister away from the window and brought her back to bed. The two lay there in silence. Then they heard footsteps, slow, heavy, passing directly in front of the bedroom door. My mother froze. Her heart pounded so hard it seemed to echo inside her chest. But her sister reacted very differently. She remained calm, almost peaceful, as if that presence were familiar. The next morning, my mother covered the gaps around the door and blocked the view from the window. She didn't want her sister watching that thing anymore. But when the girl realized what was happening, she became furious. She stared at my mother and smiled. A strange smile. A smile my mother would describe years later as deeply disturbing. Then she asked a simple question. "You're scared, aren't you?" My mother admitted that she was. And at that moment, she heard the sentence that would haunt our family for decades. "Ever since they moved the grave, she comes every night." After saying that, the girl smiled again. But there was something in that smile that made my mother wish she had never brought up the subject. Because for the first time, she realized something. Her sister didn't seem afraid of the woman. She seemed to know her. And perhaps that was exactly what made everything far more terrifying. Years passed. My mother and my aunt grew up, built their own lives, and little by little, the story of the woman in black faded into the background. Or at least, that was what everyone believed. But some things never truly disappear. They simply wait. During that time, several people who had taken part in moving the old grave died. Some from illness, others from seemingly ordinary causes. Nothing that could be directly linked to what had happened. Even so, within the family, no one could ignore an unsettling coincidence. Almost all the men who had helped move that grave were no longer alive. Among them was my grandfather. His death was one of the hardest moments of my childhood. He was known throughout the community. A respected man, always willing to help anyone in need. On the day of his funeral, so many people came that some had to remain outside the house. I was only a child, but I still remember the emptiness that remained after he was gone. And I also remember the inseparable friends who used to spend their afternoons by his side. Two of them were especially close. One was talkative and playful. The other was more reserved, known for making wooden toys for the children in the area. It was this second man who experienced one of the most terrifying events connected to the old grave. It all began on what seemed like an ordinary night. Several residents had gathered near the corral to play cards. As always, teasing and jokes were part of the fun. But that night, he was losing, and losing badly. Frustrated, he ended up sitting directly on the old reddish grave. The others laughed. They teased him, saying that perhaps the dead could help him win. The man responded in the worst possible way. Between laughter and curses, he began mocking the grave. He insulted whoever might have been buried there. He said that if he had to depend on the dead for luck, he was doomed. The others kept laughing. But the atmosphere changed almost immediately. A gust of cold swept through the area. It wasn't an ordinary breeze. It was a heavy cold, sudden, as if the temperature had dropped within seconds. Even the skeptics noticed it. The game ended shortly afterward, and everyone returned home. Alone on the dark road, the man tried to ignore the growing discomfort. But then he heard something behind him. Footsteps. Small, slow, steady. He stopped. The footsteps stopped as well. He looked back. No one. He started walking again. The footsteps returned. Closer. Clearer. For several minutes, it repeated itself. Whenever he looked, there was nobody there. But every time he continued forward, the sensation of being followed returned. And for the first time in many years, he remembered the story everyone avoided mentioning. The woman from the grave. When he finally arrived home, he locked the door and tried to forget what had happened. But the real nightmare had not even begun. The following morning, before sunrise, he would hear something that would change his life forever. A cry. The cry of a woman. And that sound seemed to be waiting for him. The next morning, he woke up before dawn, as he did every day. Life in the countryside does not wait for the sun to rise. It was still dark when he went outside to feed the animals. The cold that morning felt more intense than usual, and for some reason, the feeling of being watched was still there. While carrying bundles of feed toward the stable, he heard a strange sound. It was crying. Soft. Distant. The sound of a woman weeping. At first, he thought it might be an elderly neighbor who lived alone nearby. Concerned, he went to check on her. But when he reached her house, he found no one. The crying had vanished. He returned to work, trying to convince himself that it had all been a coincidence. A few minutes later, the sound returned, this time coming from another direction. More specifically, from the corrals near the lake. The man felt his stomach tighten. He made the sign of the cross, and continued working. But the more he tried to ignore it, the louder the sounds became. The crying, the wind, the water. Everything seemed to be drawing his attention toward the lake. Then he heard something else. The sound of someone moving in the water, as if a person were swimming. It made no sense. It was still the middle of the night. The water would have been far too cold for anyone to enter. Even so, curiosity got the better of him. He stepped into the stable and looked at the lake through a small window. He saw no one, no movement, no person, only darkness. He breathed a sigh of relief, and was about to leave when he heard the crying again. Only this time, it wasn't just crying. A voice spoke his name, clearly, without any doubt. His blood seemed to freeze in his veins. No one should have known he was there. No one could have been that close without being seen. Consumed by panic, he ran back into the house, locked the doors, closed the windows, and then made the mistake that changed everything. He looked through the window. Someone was sitting by the lake. A woman, dressed entirely in black, motionless, watching the water. For a few seconds, he was paralyzed, unable to breathe, unable to look away. Then the woman began to move. Slowly, her body lifted from the ground. First a few inches, then higher, until she was floating in the air, nearly 6 feet above the lakeshore. That was when she raised her head and spoke. Her voice did not sound human. It was deep, distorted, as though several voices were speaking at once. "Come to me." Terror spread through every part of his body. But the worst was still to come, because when the woman revealed the face hidden beneath her hair, he realized it was not a woman. It had never been. The skin was grayish, the eyes completely black, and the mouth seemed far too large for a human face, as if something were trying to imitate a person, and failing to reproduce their appearance perfectly. Then it smiled, and lunged toward him, at an impossible speed, as though it had crossed the entire distance in a single movement. And at that instant, he became absolutely certain of one thing. It wanted to get inside the house. Instinct took over. The moment he saw the creature rushing toward him, he ran. He didn't try to understand what was happening. He didn't try to fight it. He ran faster than he ever had before, across the living room, down the hallway, and locked himself inside the bedroom where his wife was still asleep. The door slammed shut so hard that she woke up in fright. She sat up in bed, confused, but before she could ask any questions, she noticed something strange. Her husband was pale, shaking, his eyes wide with pure terror. She had never seen him like that before. She tried asking what had happened, but he could barely speak. His breathing was out of control. The words came out broken and uneven, until he finally managed to say, "There's something outside." His wife stood up, confused, but before she could approach the door, they both heard a sound. A scratch, slow, deliberate, like fingernails dragging across wood. Both of them froze. The sound came again, louder, closer. This time it seemed to travel along the entire length of the door, as if something was exploring the surface, looking for a way inside. The woman looked at her husband, and in that instant she realized he wasn't imagining things, because she could hear it too. The scratching continued, followed by an even worse sound. Laughter, soft at first, almost a whisper, then louder, closer, a distorted laugh, cruel, as though whatever stood outside was enjoying their fear. For several minutes, neither of them moved, too afraid to open the door, too afraid to look out the window. They simply listened, waited, prayed that it would leave. When silence finally returned, neither had the courage to step outside immediately. They remained locked inside until sunrise. Only hours later did they finally leave the room, and the first thing the man did was seek help. That very day, he went to the community church. He told the priest everything: the encounter, the woman, the pursuit, the scratching, the laughter. The priest listened in silence, then visited the property. He prayed, blessed the house, and performed a ritual the villagers later described as something resembling an exorcism. For a time, the incidents became less frequent, but they never disappeared completely, because that presence did not seem tied only to the property. It was tied to the family, and the following years would prove exactly that. By the time the story reached me, I was still a child. I remember hearing the adults speak about it in hushed voices, always stopping the conversation whenever I came close. At the time, I paid little attention, until strange things began happening inside my own house. At first, it was my sister's dreams, recurring dreams, always the same. She ran down dark roads, trying to escape, but there was a woman dressed in black walking behind her, never rushing, never running, as if she knew that sooner or later she would catch up. At first, they seemed like ordinary nightmares, but then the dreams started bleeding into reality, and that was when we realized the entity was still among us. The nightmares began slowly, once or twice a week, then almost every night. My sister would wake up terrified, gasping for air, saying that the woman in black was getting closer. In the dreams, she never spoke, never ran, never threatened. She simply kept walking behind her, always at the same pace, always certain that she didn't need to hurry, because somehow she knew she would eventually reach her prey. As the months passed, the dreams grew more intense, until something changed. One night, while doing homework, my sister heard a sound coming from outside the house. It was crying, distant, very similar to the crying described years earlier by my grandfather's friend. She tried to ignore it, but the sound returned, closer. A few minutes later, it came again, even closer. Then something strange happened. The atmosphere began to change. Despite the summer heat, the temperature suddenly dropped. The room grew darker, and an inexplicable fear overwhelmed her. A fear so intense she could barely move. At that moment, she became certain of one thing. The woman from her dreams was nearby. Terrified, she ran to the bedroom where my mother and I were sleeping. She was pale, shaking. She asked if we had heard the crying, but we had heard absolutely nothing. According to her, the cries were so loud they made the windows vibrate. My mother believed her, not because she had heard anything, but because she knew her own family's history. The next day, we sought help once again, and that was when something happened that I will never forget. The community priest welcomed us in silence. He listened carefully, then fixed his eyes on my sister. For several seconds, he said nothing. He seemed to be reflecting on something. Then he spoke. "There's something you need to know." No one answered. The atmosphere felt heavy. Some people are able to perceive presences that most people will never see. My sister remained motionless. "You're one of those people." The priest explained that certain individuals possess an unusual sensitivity that allows them to see and hear entities that normally remain hidden. According to him, this wasn't necessarily a blessing, nor was it necessarily a curse, but it made such people more vulnerable to certain encounters. My mother looked visibly uncomfortable. So did I. But what came next was even worse. When we mentioned the woman in black, the priest fell silent again. Much longer this time. Then he said something that sent chills through us. "I've heard of her before." He explained that other people in the region had reported similar encounters, including an old friend of my grandfather, the same man who had mocked the grave years earlier. But when we asked what exactly the entity was, he simply shook his head. "I don't know." The answer surprised us. We expected explanations. We expected protection. But even he seemed to have no answers. "All I know is that it's something very powerful." The silence that followed was worse than any answer. Because for the first time, we felt that no one truly understood what was hunting us. And the priest himself admitted something that destroyed whatever sense of safety we still had left. He did not believe he was capable of confronting it, and that meant we were alone. After that conversation with the priest, we tried to carry on with our lives as if nothing had happened. At least, that's what we wanted to believe. But something had changed. The constant feeling of being watched had become part of our routine. The days seemed normal. The nights did not. That was when the apparitions began to multiply. It was no longer just the woman in black. Other figures started appearing inside the house. I often woke up in the middle of the night for no apparent reason. And almost every time, the same thing happened. The moment I opened my eyes, I would see someone standing beside my bed, motionless, watching. It was a man. He wore old-fashioned clothes and a hat similar to those worn by farm workers. He never spoke, never came closer. He simply remained there, only inches away, for several seconds, until he vanished. Sometimes I also saw a little girl, small, silent, standing in dark hallways or near bedroom doors. Neither apparition seemed aggressive, but that didn't make them any less frightening. It felt as if the house was becoming more and more crowded, as though something was drawing presences toward us. Meanwhile, my sister's nightmares continued, more frequent, more intense, until one night, everything changed. She was awake, reading. It was nearly midnight when she decided to get up, pull back the curtain, and look outside. Our house stood near the lake. The same lake where the entity had appeared decades earlier. The moment she moved the curtain aside, her entire body froze. The fear was instant, paralyzing. There she was, the woman in black, exactly as she appeared in the dreams, standing beside the water, motionless, waiting. My sister could barely breathe. She couldn't look away. Then the woman began to rise, slowly, as if some invisible force was lifting her from the ground. The higher her body floated, the closer her laughter seemed. A muffled laugh, distorted, inhuman. The entity started moving her lips. She was saying something, but it wasn't Portuguese. It wasn't any language my sister recognized. It sounded ancient, strange, impossible to understand. Even so, amid the incomprehensible words, she understood one sentence. A single sentence. And she never forgot it. I will take one. As those words echoed through the darkness, my sister ran. She raced down the hallway, burst into my room, and woke me immediately. One look at her face was enough to know that something terrible had happened. She was in shock, shaking, barely able to speak. My mother tried to calm her down, but the truth was that none of us knew what to do anymore. The priest had no answers. The prayers had not ended the disturbances. And now the entity was no longer merely watching. It seemed to have announced an intention, a promise, or perhaps a threat. And the most terrifying part was that no one knew whom she intended to take. After that night, fear became part of our daily lives. My mother tried to stop us from talking about it. She said we were feeding something we didn't understand. Maybe she was right, but it was difficult to ignore, especially when the events continued. A few days later, I was awakened by a woman's voice calling my name. At first, I thought it was my mother. I sat up slightly and looked at the clock. It was 3 in the morning. The entire house was immersed in darkness. Convinced that I had dreamed it, I tried to go back to sleep. But then I heard it again. My name. This time clearer. Closer. I sat up in bed, turned on the light, looked around every corner of the room. No one was there. Even so, the voice returned. Again, and again, and again. Altogether, I heard my name called several times. The last time, it seemed to come from right beside me, as if someone were leaning over my shoulder. The next morning, I told my family everything. My sister immediately remembered the priest's warning, and asked a question no one could answer. If it wasn't human, who was calling me? My mother ended the conversation immediately. Days later, she asked the priest to return and bless the house once more. This time, however, he seemed far more concerned. After finishing the prayers, he asked to speak with us. I will never forget his words. She wants something. Silence filled the room. I don't know exactly what, but she's looking for someone. My mother asked if there was any way to stop her. The priest lowered his head and didn't answer. At that moment, we understood everything. Even he didn't know how to help us. For a while, the phenomena became less frequent. The apparitions grew rarer. The crying disappeared. The nights began to feel normal again. And little by little, we believed it was finally over. But it wasn't over. She was only waiting. Years passed. My sister and I moved away. We tried to leave those memories behind. Even so, strange events occasionally resurfaced at different moments in our lives. Nothing as intense as before. Until my aunt returned to the old property to care for my great-grandfather, who was now very elderly. She had recently given birth to another child. Just like the first time, the baby had not yet been baptized. One night, the dogs began barking non-stop. At first in the distance, then closer and closer to the house. My aunt tried to ignore it, but something seemed to be approaching. Then the barking suddenly stopped, and the silence lasted only a few seconds. Soon afterward, a new sound appeared. Something was scratching the outside walls, climbing slowly upward, as if a creature were scaling the house. The scratching continued until it reached the roof. Then she heard voices, female voices, distorted laughter, mocking, cruel. Among those voices, one stood out. My aunt recognized it immediately. It was the same voice that had terrified her since childhood, the same woman in black. And she said only one sentence: "I came to take him." At that moment, my aunt knew exactly whom she was talking about. The baby. Terror filled the room. When she looked toward the window, she saw something emerging from the darkness. At first, it resembled a human face, but slowly it began to change. Its eyes turned red, its features twisted, its teeth lengthened, transforming into something impossible to describe. Shaking, she grabbed the bottle of holy water she kept beside the bed. The moment she raised it, the creature let out a violent growl and vanished from the roof. Outside, the dogs began barking again, chasing something toward the sugarcane field. After that, everything fell silent. It was the last time anyone in my family saw that entity, at least until now. But the truth is that no one believes she truly went away. The old grave still stands where it has always been, forgotten by time, untouched. And sometimes I wonder whether everything began the day they decided to move it, or if it had been there long before that, waiting, watching, choosing. Because deep down, I still have the feeling that that presence never gave up. And perhaps it is simply waiting for the right moment to return. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more frightening accounts based on supposedly real events, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Leave a like to support the content and help the channel bring you more horror stories. And now I want to hear your opinion. Do you believe the entity was connected to the old grave, or do you think something far older had already been living on that property?